So, this whole thing started with a key. A big, heavy, iron skeleton key that felt like it belonged in a Gothic novel, not in the palm of my hand. I guess, looking back, that should have been the first sign. My name is Alara. At the time, I was in my final year of an architectural history program, and I'd just landed the kind of internship that makes your classmates hate you. I was tasked with being the sole archivist for the Miltonberger House in the Garden District of New Orleans. The job was simple on paper. Spend the summer cataloging and sketching every original architectural detail left in the place before the Historical Society decided what to do with it. For an architecture nerd like me, it wasn't a job, it was a pilgrimage. The first day I walked in, I felt it, the sheer weight of the silence. You know how some quiet places still have a hum? The buzz of a refrigerator, the whisper of air conditioning, the distant sound of traffic. The Miltonberger House had none of that. Its power had been cut for years. It was a true, deep, vacuum of space kind of quiet. And it was huge, the kind of place where you could yell at one end and someone at the other might just hear a faint disturbance in the air. But I was the only one there. That was a condition of the internship, actually. Unfettered access, no interruptions. My professor, Mr. Dubois, had called it a perfect academic isolation chamber. I wrote about it in my work log that first night, trying to sound professional, but I'm pretty sure the giddiness bled through the ink. I described the smell. It wasn't just old house musty. It was this specific, layered scent of ancient cypress wood, damp plaster, decaying velvet, and something else, something sweet and dry like old paper. I wrote about the light, the way it forced its way through a century of grime on the tall, arching windows, cutting the darkness into solid, hazy beams filled with swirling dust motes. They looked like ghosts, dancing. I was completely, utterly in love with the place. The loneliness wasn't oppressive, it felt respectful. Like the house and I had an understanding. I was there to listen to its stories, and it was letting me. I set up my workstation in the main ballroom. It was the only room with enough consistent light to work by. I had a folding table, my laptop, a case of drafting pencils, rolls of vellum, my tape measures, a camera, and a digital audio recorder I used to take verbal notes. It looked like a little island of modern, clinical order in an ocean of elegant decay. The first week was bliss. I moved from room to room, sketching cornices, documenting the intricate ironwork of the balconies, taking high-resolution photos of the ceiling medallions. The work was slow, methodical. I'd put on headphones sometimes, but mostly I just worked in the silence, letting the sheer scale of the house wrap around me. I felt safe. I felt focused. The trouble started in week 2. The honeymoon phase was over, and the real grunt work began. This was the part one was actually most excited about. Cross-referencing the original 1850s blueprints with the house's current state. It's like being a detective. You look for changes, walls that were moved, doors that were sealed up. It tells you how the family lived, how their needs changed over time. I had the original linen blueprints, carefully unrolled and weighted down on a second table. They were beautiful, spidery things. The ink faded to a soft brown. I started on the ground floor. Everything matched up perfectly, give or take a few inches, which you expect with 170-year-old construction. The main parlors, the dining room, the grand staircase. It was all there, just as the architect had intended. Then I moved to the second floor. The master suite, the guest rooms, all fine. Then I got to the back of the house, to the servants' wing. And that's when I found it. According to the blueprint, the far northwest corner of the second floor housed a small, simple bedroom, designated for a senior house servant. It was a narrow room, with one window overlooking the back garden. Its east wall was supposed to be shared with the massive central chimney stack that served the fireplaces in the master bedroom and the downstairs parlor. A simple, solid wall. It was all drawn right there in faded brown ink. But when I stood in the room, something was wrong. The feeling was immediate, even before I took out the tape measure. It was a spatial feeling. Any architect or designer will tell you they can feel the proportions of a room, and this room felt wrong. It felt shorter than it should be. I took out my laser measure. I measured the width of the room, from the hallway door to the far window. It matched the plans. Then I measured the length, from the exterior wall to that interior wall, the one supposedly flush against the main chimney. My measure read 12 feet. I looked at the blueprint. The plan called for 17 feet. My first thought was, okay, I messed up. I measured again. Same result. 12 feet. I double-checked the plans, running my finger along the architect's careful notations. No, it was clear as day. 17 feet. 5 feet. 5 feet of the house were just gone, missing from this room. I walked over to the wall in question. It was covered in the same faded, peeling floral wallpaper as the rest of the room. It looked completely solid, but 5 feet is not a small amount of space. It's the width of a large closet. It's wide enough for a small hallway. It was a significant, unaccounted for chunk of real estate inside a house that was, until that moment, perfectly documented. My mind, the logical, academic part of my mind, immediately started cycling through possibilities. The most obvious one was a renovation. Maybe they built a new wall to hide crumbling plaster or run new plumbing, though there was no sign of it. But if they had, it would be the only major structural change in the entire house that wasn't documented somewhere. The Miltenberger family were obsessive record keepers. A more remote possibility was a construction error. Maybe the builders had misread the plans and just framed the room 5 feet short. It seemed unlikely for such a grand and otherwise meticulously constructed house. I took out my sketchbook and a fresh sheet of paper. I drew the floor plan of the servants' wing as it existed, not as the plans said it should. I drew the small bedroom, and then I drew the outline of the chimney stack based on its position in the other rooms. And there it was, on my paper. A long, narrow rectangle of empty space. About 5 feet wide and 12 feet long. A void, a gap between the bedroom wall and the chimney. An architectural impossibility that was, undeniably, there. I spent the rest of the afternoon on it. I went downstairs to the parlor that sat directly below. Its dimensions were correct. The chimney was exactly where it should be. I went up to the attic. The roof trusses and floor joists all seemed to align with the original plans. It was just this one section, on this one floor, that was wrong. It was a pocket of space that, according to the blueprints, shouldn't exist. It was a blank spot on the map. In my notes, I wrote out my theories about construction errors and undocumented repairs. I tried to make it sound detached, professional. But then I drew the floor plan again, and in the space, the void, I wrote in neat, block letters, anomalous gap. The light was starting to fail, turning the dust beams from gold to a soft, gloomy orange. The house's deep silence seemed to be pressing in a little more now. The thrill of discovery was starting to get replaced by a different feeling. A quiet, buzzing unease. It was illogical. It was just a wall. It was just a measurement error. But I couldn't shake the image of that 5-foot wide sliver of nothing, running the length of the room right next to me. I packed up most of my gear, but I kept lingering in the servant's bedroom, just staring at the wall. The air was colder back here, away from the big sunny windows of the ballroom. I walked up to the wall, my footsteps echoing unnaturally loud in the evening quiet. I was alone. I knew I was alone. I had the only key. But standing there, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It was stupid, a classic horror movie cliché my own mind was inventing because the house was old and creepy. Still, the academic in me, the part that needed to know, took over. I raised my hand and curled my fingers into a loose fist. I tapped my knuckles against the wallpaper. It wasn't a solid, satisfying thud of plaster and lath against brick. It was a thump, a dull, flat, hollow sound. A sound that didn't echo right, that seemed to be absorbed into whatever was on the other side. The sound of a knock on a box. A sound that said, clear as day, that there was nothing behind this wall but empty air. The noise hung there for a second, then was swallowed by the profound silence of the house. I stood there, my hands still inches from the wall, and every hair on my arm stood on end. For the first time, the quiet of the Miltenberger house didn't feel peaceful. It felt like it was holding its breath. That hollow sound stayed with me all night. I packed up in a hurry, not even bothering to organize my pencils, just sweeping everything into my bag. I remember my hands shaking as I fumbled with the huge iron key to lock the front door. The click of the bolt echoed down the empty street, and it sounded less like securing something and more like trapping something inside. I practically ran to my car. The whole drive home, I tried to talk myself down. I'm an academic, a rational person. It was an old house. Old houses make noises. The wall was probably just built strangely, maybe with an air gap for insulation against the chimney heat, a weird, undocumented technique. The hollow sound was just acoustics. My feeling of being watched? That was just my imagination, fueled by a day of total isolation and the discovery of a weird architectural quirk. By the time I got back to my tiny apartment, I had almost convinced myself. I ate dinner, put on some loud music to fill the silence, and forced myself to focus on transcribing my notes, deliberately avoiding the audio clip of me knocking on that wall. The next morning, I felt better. The New Orleans sun was bright, the air was thick and humid, and the spooky shadows of the Miltenberger house seemed like a distant memory. I walked in with a renewed sense of purpose. It's just a house, Alara. You're a scientist, not a character in a horror movie. I set up my table in the ballroom like always. The sunlight was beautiful, cutting through the dusty air. I laid out my vellum, my scales, and reached into my carrying case for my favorite pencil. It's a specific one, a Staedtler Mars Lumograph 2B. Every artist or drafter has their favorite, the one that just feels right in their hand. But it wasn't there. I checked the main compartment, then the side pockets. Nothing. I emptied the whole bag onto the floor. No pencil. Okay, annoying, but not the end of the world. I must have dropped it yesterday when I was packing up in such a rush. Or maybe I'd left it on the table and it had rolled off. I spent a good 10 minutes searching the floor around my workstation, my knees getting dusty on the old wood. Nothing. I sighed, frustrated. I had other pencils, but it was like a chef losing their favorite knife. It just threw off the whole mood. I made a mental note to look for it later and got to work with a lesser, backup pencil. The day was uneventful. I worked on the ground floor, double-checking some measurements in the dining room to take my mind off the servants' wing. It was methodical, comforting work. Around 3 p.m., I took a break and decided to do a proper search for the pencil. I started in the ballroom, then retraced my steps from the day before. I went up the grand staircase, my footsteps the only sound. I went into the master bedroom. And then I went into the small, adjacent sitting room, a room I was positive I hadn't entered at all yesterday. And there it was, sitting perfectly centered on the dusty white marble of the windowsill, catching a single beam of afternoon light. My Staedtler pencil. I just stood there, staring at it. It wasn't dropped, it wasn't lost, it was placed. My first thought, the logical one, was relief. Great, I found it. My second thought, cold and sharp, was, how? I had no memory of coming into this room. Why would I have? I wasn't working in here. Why would I walk in, set my pencil down perfectly in the middle of the sill, and then walk out and forget the entire event? I tried to reconstruct it. Maybe I'd wandered in while taking a phone call? No, cell service was non-existent inside the house. Maybe I'd come in to look at the plasterwork and set it down without thinking? It was possible. Stress and hyperfocus can do weird things to your memory. I told myself that's what it had to be. I was just overworked. I picked up the pencil, the graphite cool against my fingers, and tried to ignore the little knot of unease tightening in my stomach. It was just a pencil. I was being ridiculous. A few days went by. The unease faded, buried under the workload. I finished the first floor, and I knew I couldn't put it off any longer. I had to go back upstairs. I had to finish documenting the servants' wing. I had to deal with the anomalous gap. This time, I was all business. I brought a heavy-duty flashlight and my long, flexible metal tape measure. I worked in the creepy little bedroom, trying my best to ignore the wall. I measured floorboards, window casings, the height of the ceiling. I took photos. After about an hour, I needed the tape measure to get the final dimension of the room's length again, for the record. I reached down to where I'd left it coiled on the floor next to my bag. It was gone. My heart didn't just sink, it plummeted. No, not again. This was different. The pencil was small. A tape measure is a bright yellow, 5-inch wide disc of metal and plastic. It's heavy. You don't just misplace it. I stood up and did a slow, 360-degree turn. The room was small and practically empty, save for a single broken chair in the corner. It wasn't in here. A new feeling started to creep in, colder than the unease from before. It was a prickly, angry sort of fear. I felt like I was being messed with. Okay, I said out loud, the words sounding loud and foreign in the silence. Very funny. I was talking to myself, or maybe to the house. I wasn't sure which was crazier. I started searching, my movements sharp and agitated. I stalked out of the room and into the narrow servants' hall. I looked down the main hall toward the grand staircase. Nothing. Then I looked the other way toward the steep, tight spiraled back staircase that the servants would have used. It was sitting on the third step down. The bright yellow case was impossible to miss against the dark, grimy wood. This time, there was no rationalization. There was no way I had put it there. To get to that staircase from the room I was in, I would have had to walk out, turn right, go down the hall 20 feet, and specifically place it on that step. It was not on my path. It served no purpose. I hadn't been near that staircase all day. I walked over slowly, my sneakers making no sound on the threadbare runner. I picked it up. It felt cold, inert. It was just a tape measure. But holding it, I felt violated. The feeling of being watched came back with a vengeance. It was no longer a vague sensation. It was a certainty. I stood there on the landing, clutching the tape measure, and looked around at the silent doors, the peeling wallpaper, the deep shadows in the corners. The quiet of the house was no longer holding its breath. It was listening, it was watching, and it was playing with me. From that moment on, the house was different. It was no longer a beautiful, lonely archive. It was a hostile space. I started locking the heavy front door from the inside when I arrived, a completely useless gesture since I was the only one with a key, but it made me feel marginally safer. Every creak of the old floorboards made me jump. I found myself humming constantly, just to fill the oppressive silence. I stopped working late. As soon as the light started to fade, I was out of there. The breaking point came on a Thursday. It was hot, even for New Orleans, and the air in the house was stagnant and suffocating. I'd packed a light lunch, a sandwich and a granola bar. I ate at my table in the ballroom, forcing myself to stay in the biggest, most open space. When I was done, I did what I always did. I crumpled up my sandwich wrapper and the granola bar wrapper and shoved them into the small plastic grocery bag I used as my personal trash can, which I kept tied to the leg of my folding table. The rest of the afternoon was tense. I was trying to draw a detailed sketch of the main fireplace mantel, but I couldn't focus. My eyes kept darting toward the shadows under the grand staircase. I imagined a figure standing there, just watching. I was jumpy, on edge, and my drawing was sloppy. Finally, I gave up. It was only 4 p.m., but I couldn't take it anymore. I just wanted to leave. I packed my bag, my movements quick and jerky. I slung it over my shoulder and grabbed my little bag of trash to take with me. As I untied it from the table leg, I noticed it felt lighter than it should. I glanced inside. The sandwich wrapper was there, but the granola bar wrapper, a very specific silver and blue foil wrapper, was gone. I froze. I told myself it must have fallen out. I looked all around the table, under it, in my work bag. Nothing. I felt a surge of frustration. Where the hell could a piece of trash have gone? Shaking my head, I decided to just leave it. It was just a wrapper. Who cares? But it bothered me. It was another small thing, another piece of my world that was out of place. I was walking toward the front door when a thought struck me. It was a stupid, paranoid thought, but I couldn't shake it. I turned and walked back to the other side of the ballroom, to a large, ornate rosewood credenza that stood against the far wall. I hadn't touched it since I'd arrived. Its drawers were all shut, covered in a thick layer of dust. I was sure some of them were locked or warped shut from a century of humidity. My hand trembled as I reached for the small, topmost drawer on the right side. I pulled the brass handle. It was stuck. I pulled harder, my knuckles white. It resisted, then gave way with a loud, groaning shriek of dry wood scraping against dry wood. The sound was obscene in the quiet room. I looked inside. The drawer was empty, save for a thick lining of dust. Except for in the very center. There, placed with perfect, deliberate care, was my granola bar wrapper. It wasn't crumpled like I'd left it. It had been unfolded, smoothed out, and then folded again into a neat, tiny square, no bigger than a postage stamp. I stared at it, the neat little silver and blue square sitting in the middle of the dusty drawer. The world seemed to dissolve into a low hum. That wasn't my doing. I crumple things, I don't fold them. That wasn't an accident. A gust of wind couldn't have opened a stuck drawer and placed a piece of trash inside, neatly folded. That was an action, an intelligent, purposeful action. I remembered crumpling it in my fist. I remembered stuffing it into the bag. My memory was clear. There was no room for doubt this time. There was no plausible deniability. This wasn't me being forgetful. This wasn't stress. This was a message, and it could only mean one thing. I wasn't alone in the Miltenberger house. And whoever else was here, they were watching every single thing I did. I slammed the drawer shut. The sound cracked through the ballroom like a gunshot, echoing in the high, silent corners. I didn't even care. For a long moment, I just stood there, my hand still on the brass handle, my breath caught in my throat. My heart was hammering against my ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. The folded wrapper, the neat little silver and blue square. It wasn't just that something had been moved. It was the care that had been taken. This wasn't a stray animal dragging a piece of trash. This was tidy. It was deliberate. It was a statement. I saw you. I was here. I touched your things. I know what you do. I backed away from the credenza slowly, as if it were a venomous snake. I didn't turn my back on it. I backed all the way across the vast, dusty floor, my eyes scanning the deep shadows under the staircase, the gaps in the velvet curtains, the dark maw of the hallway leading to the back of the house. The silence pressed in on me, heavy and alive. It was the silence of a held breath. I fumbled with the lock on the front door, my hands shaking so badly it took 3 tries to get the key into the slot. The heavy bolt slid home behind me with a deafening thud, and I was out in the thick, humid air of the late afternoon. I didn't look back. I practically sprinted to my car, got in, and locked the doors, my chest heaving. I sat there for a full minute, just staring at the grand, decaying facade of the Miltenberger house, trying to make my lungs work properly. The rational part of my brain, the part that had gotten me this far in life, was in full-blown rebellion. It was screaming at me. You're stressed. You're alone in a huge, creepy house all day. You're misremembering. You folded the wrapper yourself. You were distracted. You put it in the drawer for some reason you can't recall. It was trying so hard to build a wall of logic against the rising tide of absolute terror. But I knew, in that place deep inside you that doesn't use logic, the old, animal part of the brain, I knew. I had crumpled that wrapper. I had shoved it in the bag. Someone, or something, had taken it out, opened a drawer that had been sealed with age and dust, smoothed it, folded it into a perfect square, placed it dead center, and shut the drawer again. I wasn't alone. The drive home was a blur. I don't remember the traffic or the route I took. I just remember gripping the steering wheel, my knuckles white, replaying the image of that little silver square in my mind. When I got back to my apartment, I didn't turn on music. The noise felt wrong. I walked through my small, bright space, touching my own things, my books, my laptop, the mug on my counter. These were my things. They were where I left them. The order felt fragile and temporary. For the first time, my own home didn't feel entirely safe. It just felt like a place my stalker hadn't found yet. I barely slept. Every creak of my apartment building, every siren in the distance, sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. I kept thinking about the key in my possession. The only key. It was a laughable security. It was meant to keep people out. It did nothing to contain what was already inside. I should have called my professor. I should have quit. Any sane person would have. But there's this weird thing that happens when you're faced with something truly impossible. You can't quite accept it. Quitting would mean admitting it was real. Admitting that someone was living inside the walls of the Miltenberger house, watching me. It was easier, somehow, to pretend I was just being paranoid. Besides, this was my thesis. My entire academic future was tied up in these drawings. I told myself I just needed to finish. Get in, get the work done, and get out. Never look back. The next day, I walked into the house with a new kind of fear. It wasn't the jumpy, on-edge feeling from before. It was a cold, heavy dread that sat in the pit of my stomach. I was hyper-aware of everything. I worked in the ballroom again, needing the open space, but I couldn't escape the feeling. I felt like I had a giant target painted on my back. The silence was the worst part. It felt personal now. Every long, empty stretch of quiet was a reminder that I was being observed. I had to go back upstairs. The servants' wing was still unfinished. The anomalous gap was still just a question mark on my plans. Around 4 o'clock, when the Louisiana sun starts to dip and the light slanting through the dusty windows turns a thick, syrupy gold, it started. I was in the small bedroom, the one next to the main chimney. The one with the hollow wall. I was sketching the window frame, trying to focus on the intricate joinery, anything to keep my mind off the space behind the plaster. The house was dead quiet. And then I heard it. It was a tiny sound. So faint, I thought I'd imagined it. A soft, dry, shuffling sound. SSSSHH, SSSSHHHK. It came from the wall. The wall with the gap. I froze, pencil hovering over the paper. I held my breath, straining to listen. Silence. Had I imagined it? A mouse, maybe. The house settling. I let out my breath and tried to go back to my drawing, but my hand was shaking. SSSHH, SSHH, SSK, RK. There it was again. It sounded like fabric. like rough spun cloth or a canvas bag, being dragged slowly along the inside of the wall. A mouse couldn't make that sound. This was larger, slower. I stood up, taking a silent step closer to the wall. I put my ear against the old, peeling wallpaper. It was cool against my skin. For a moment, nothing. Then I heard it again, closer this time, right on the other side of the plaster. A slow, rhythmic scrape and shuffle. And with it, something else. A new sensation, a smell. It wasn't the familiar scent of the house, the dry, spicy smell of old wood and dust and decay. This was organic. It was faint, but it was unmistakable. It was the sour, coppery smell of unwashed human skin, the stale scent of someone who has been sleeping in their own clothes for too long. It was the smell of life, but a furtive, unclean kind of life. It seeped through the wall like a poison. I recoiled, a wave of nausea washing over me. The smell, more than the sound, made it real. It was proof. An animal doesn't smell like that. That was a human smell. My heart was jackhammering. I fumbled for my phone, my fingers slipping on the screen. My first instinct was to call the police. But what would I say? Hello, I think there's a ghost in my wall and he smells bad? They'd think I was a crank. I needed proof. My thumb found the voice memo app. I held the phone's microphone as close to the wall as I dared, my knuckles almost touching the plaster. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, motionless, recording the silence, praying for the sound to come back. The shuffling started again, fainter this time, further down the wall. I followed it, holding the phone steady. After about 2 minutes, it stopped. The silence returned, thicker and more menacing than before. I retreated to my table in the ballroom, my legs feeling like they were full of water. I sat down, plugged in my headphones, and played the recording back. Nothing, just the low, electronic hiss of static. The microphone hadn't been sensitive enough. The sounds had been too subtle, too absorbed by the thick plaster and horsehair insulation. Listening to the recording, there was no shuffling. There was no proof. There was only the empty sound of a quiet room. A new, terrifying thought wormed its way into my head. What if I did imagine it? What if the smell, the sound, what if it's all in my head? I was so wound up, so terrified by the rapper incident, maybe my mind was just inventing things now. The lack of evidence on the recording was almost scarier than the sounds themselves. It isolated me completely. I was a witness with no credibility, not even to myself. I couldn't stay a minute longer. I packed up my things in a frantic, sloppy rush, shoving tools and papers into my bag without looking. I just had to get out. Get into the sun, get away from the sounds and the smells that may or may not be real. I fled the house, locking the door behind me, and drove away in a stupor of fear and self-doubt. It wasn't until I was sitting in my apartment that night, staring at a blank wall, that the second wave of horror hit me. It was a slow, sickening realization that started in my stomach and spread through my entire body, leaving me cold. My sketchbook, my large, A3-sized, coiled-bound sketchbook. The one with all my work, all my detailed, measured drawings, my notes, my entire thesis. It wasn't in my bag. I had left it. In my haste, in my terror, I had left it on the folding table in the ballroom of the Miltenberger house. Alone, in the dark, with whatever was in the walls. The night was the longest of my life. I didn't sleep. I just sat on my sofa, staring at the door, imagining what was happening to it. Would it be destroyed, defaced, or would it just be studied? The thought of some unseen thing paging through my work, my drawings, my handwriting, was a profound violation. By morning, I was a wreck, but I knew I had to go back. I had to get it. I drove to the Garden District as the sun was rising, the streets quiet and misty. I parked, my hands slick with sweat on the steering wheel, and walked up the path. Each step felt like I was walking to my own execution. I unlocked the massive front door. The air that rolled out to meet me was the same as always, cool, dusty, silent. I stepped inside, locking the door behind me. My footsteps echoed as I walked into the ballroom. And there it was, my sketchbook. It was sitting right where I'd left it, in the middle of the table. It was closed. It looked completely undisturbed. A tidal wave of relief washed over me. It was okay. Nothing had happened. It was all in my head. The fear had made me careless, that's all. I walked over, my fear subsiding, replaced by a sheepish embarrassment. I picked up the sketchbook. It felt solid, real, mine. I smiled a little, a shaky, exhausted smile. I decided to just grab it and leave for the day, go get some coffee and reset my brain. As I tucked it under my arm, I decided to do a quick check. Just to be sure, I opened the cover and started flipping through the pages. The plasterwork of the main hall, the details of the fireplace, the floor plan of the ground floor, everything was there just as I'd drawn it. My neat, precise pencil lines, my tidy notes in the margins. I kept flipping. My heart rate started to slow down, returning to normal. Then I got to the page, the one I had been working on yesterday before I fled. The drawing of the servant's wing, dominated by the large, blank rectangle I had labeled in my block lettering, anomalous gap. I stared at the page. Everything looked normal. My lines, my measurements, my notes. It was all there. I was about to close the book, to dismiss the whole night of terror as a wild overreaction. But then I saw it. It was a small change, a tiny addition, so faint it was almost invisible against the grain of the paper. Inside the large rectangle of the anomalous gap, a new shape had been drawn. It was another, smaller rectangle, not drawn with my steady, ruler straight lines, but with a wavering, hesitant pencil stroke. The line was shaky, almost weak, as if drawn by a hand that was trembling or unused to holding a pencil. Beside this wobbly rectangle, there was a single, tiny, dark dot. My blood ran cold, my breath hitched. It was a perfect, unmistakable architectural symbol. A door, and a doorknob. It wasn't my drawing. It wasn't my pencil stroke. It wasn't my hand. Someone had opened my book. They had turned to this exact page, and with a quiet, deliberate, and terrifyingly intimate gesture, they had shown me the way out. Their way out. I stood there for a long time. Just stood in the middle of the grand, empty ballroom, the sketchbook held open in my hands, staring at the page. The world seemed to fall away. There was no dust, no ancient silence, no oppressive heat. There was only the drawing, my drawing, and the thing that was not my drawing. A door, a doorknob. It was shaky, weak, the lines were faint, like a whisper on the paper. But it was undeniably there. It was a communication, a reply. I had found the blank space, the question mark in the architecture, and someone, something, had answered. It had looked over my shoulder, waited until I was gone, and then, with a quiet and terrifying intimacy, it had taken my work and added its own. It had corrected my floor plan. My first thought wasn't rational. It was a pure, animal command. Drop it. Get away from it. I slammed the sketchbook shut. The sound was like a car door slamming in the quiet house, sharp and violent. I didn't throw it. I couldn't. It was my thesis. It was my whole future. I just placed it back on the table, carefully, as if it were a bomb. I backed away, one step at a time, my eyes never leaving the closed book. The silence rushed back in to fill the space, but it was different now. It was no longer the passive silence of an empty building. It was the active, listening silence of a predator. It felt heavy with attention. I could feel eyes on me. I knew it, in that deep, gut-level way you know when you're being watched. From the shadows on the high mezzanine. From the dark hallway that led to the servants' quarters. From the wall. I got out of there. I don't remember fumbling with the keys this time. I think my body was on autopilot, a system that had learned the routine of escape. The drive back to my apartment was a blank. I sat in traffic, I made the turns, but my mind was stuck in that ballroom, circling that little shaky rectangle on the page. That night, for the first time, I couldn't even pretend to myself anymore. This wasn't stress. This wasn't my overactive imagination. This wasn't a series of unlucky coincidences. This was real. There was someone in that house. Someone living in the walls. They were smart. They were patient. And they were toying with me. The drawing was the final piece of proof, and the most terrifying part was, it was proof only I could understand. I sat on my sofa, the bright, cheerful lights of my apartment feeling like a flimsy shield. I thought about what I should do. The logical steps. Call Professor Albright. Call the police. I played out the conversations in my head. Professor? It's Alara. Yes, the project is going, well, something's happened. I think someone is living in the Miltenberger house. What? Alara, that's impossible. The Foundation has the only key. Are you sure? Yes. They're moving my things. And they drew a door in my sketchbook. I could hear the pause on the other end of the line. The concerned, slightly patronizing tone that would follow. The suggestion that maybe the pressure was getting to me, that maybe I needed a break. I'd be dismissed as unstable. My project, my credibility, all of it would be jeopardized. The police would be even worse. Hello, 911. What's your emergency? Hi, I'm working in the Miltonberger house on Prytania Street, and I think someone's been breaking in. Okay, ma'am, has anything been stolen? Is there damage to the property? No, not exactly, but he took my candy wrapper and folded it, and he drew a little door on my blueprints. I'd be a joke, a crank call, a waste of their time. They'd send a squad car, the officers would walk through the house with their flashlights, find nothing, and leave, shaking their heads and telling me to lock the doors. But the problem wasn't getting in. The problem was already in. The realization settled on me like a shroud. I was completely and utterly alone in this. My proof was my curse. It was so personal, so specific to my work and my experience, that it was meaningless to anyone else. It was a secret told only to me. I didn't sleep. I just sat there as the hours crawled by. And as the initial terror started to wear off, replaced by the exhaustion of a mind running in circles, something else began to take its place. It started as a low heat in my chest and slowly grew. Anger. A deep, burning, and defiant anger. Who was this person? Who did they think they were? To hide in the dark and watch me. To touch my things. To invade my workspace, my project, my life's work, and mark it with their filth. To treat me like a specimen in their private little terrarium. The drawing wasn't just a communication, it was a power play. A calculated act of psychological warfare. I am here, you are not alone, and I can get to you whenever I want. The fear was still there, a cold knot of dread in my stomach. But now the anger was wrapped around it, and the anger gave me a strange kind of strength, a reckless resolve. No, I wasn't going to be scared away. I wasn't going to quit. This was my house, my project. I wouldn't let some shadow drive me out. If no one else would believe me, if no one else could help me, then I would handle it myself. I had to know, I had to see who it was. I had to face them. The plan formed in my mind, simple and crazy. The house was always locked. No one ever came by. The foundation left me completely alone. So, the quietest time, the time I would be most certain to be undisturbed, would be a weekend night. Friday. I'd stay late on Friday. I wouldn't leave at 5. I'd stay into the evening, into the night. I'd bring a powerful flashlight, food, a thermos of coffee. I would set myself up in the ballroom, where I had the most open space, and I would just wait. I'd be quiet. I'd be bait. I would see what happened when the thing in the wall thought I was gone for the night. I would get my own proof. Maybe a picture, a video, something the world couldn't deny. The next 2 days, Wednesday and Thursday, were the most nerve-wracking of my life. Walking into the house felt like stepping into a cage with an animal I couldn't see. The anger from the night before was my shield, but it was a thin one. Underneath, the terror was constant. I worked with a furious, frenzied energy, trying to use the activity to block out the fear. I forced myself to go back upstairs, to the servants' wing. I measured the cornices, the baseboards, anything but the wall. But my awareness of it was absolute. It was like a physical presence at the edge of my vision. The strangest thing was the silence. There were no more sounds. No shuffling, no faint scrapes, no smell, nothing. It was as if the drawing in the sketchbook had been the final word. The entity in the wall had made its move and was now simply waiting for my response. This quiet was infinitely worse than the noises had been. It was a deliberate, knowing stillness. The silence of observation, the silence of patience. It filled the house with a sense of unbearable anticipation. Every time I moved a tool, the sound felt like a violation of a sacred, terrifying pact. I was a mouse in a room with a cat that was pretending to be asleep. By Friday afternoon, I was a wreck. I was running on caffeine and pure adrenaline. My hands trembled as I packed my bag for the evening. Not my usual work bag, but a backpack. A heavy-duty Maglite flashlight. A portable power bank for my phone. A couple of bottles of water and some protein bars. In a side pocket, I put a heavy, all-metal T-square from my drafting kit. It wasn't much of a weapon, but holding its cold, solid weight in my hand felt better than nothing. I spent the last hour of daylight organizing my station in the ballroom. I positioned my folding table so my back was to a solid wall, facing the main staircase and the hallway to the back of the house. I had a clear line of sight. I laid out my tools, my sketchbook, still open to a blank page. I couldn't bear to look at the drawing of the door, and waited. My heart beat a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. Thump, thump, thump. As 5 o'clock came and went, the world outside seemed to quiet down. The rush hour traffic on the distant streets faded. The light coming through the tall, grimy windows softened from gold to a dusky orange, then to a deep purple. The shadows in the corners of the room deepened, stretching and merging until the far reaches of the ballroom were lost in darkness. That's when I noticed the change in the air, a sudden drop in temperature. The thick, humid air of the Louisiana evening was being replaced by something cooler, charged with static. Outside, the sky had turned a sickly, bruised gray. The trees in the garden, which had been still all day, began to toss their branches restlessly. A low rumble, so deep I felt it in the floorboards more than heard it, rolled across the city. Thunder. I looked out the window. The sky was boiling. Huge, dark storm clouds were piling up, moving in fast from the Gulf. A fat drop of rain splattered against the glass. Then another. Then a dozen. Within minutes, a torrential downpour was hammering against the old house, the sound a deafening roar on the slate roof. A flash of lightning lit up the ballroom for a split second, casting the dust motes into stark, dancing relief, followed by a crack of thunder that shook the very foundations of the building. I sat at my table, my hand gripping my heavy flashlight. This wasn't part of the plan. A storm. It would cover any sound. It would cut me off completely. And then, as if on cue, the single, bare bulb I had rigged up in the center of the room flickered once. It flickered again, casting stuttering, nightmarish shadows across the walls. Then it went out. The house was plunged into absolute, pitch-black darkness. The only sensations left the roar of the rain and the frantic, wild beating of my own heart. The darkness was total. I mean, it wasn't just, the lights are out, dark. You have to understand, in the city, there's always some light, a glow from the street, headlights, something. But in the Miltenberger house, walled in by ancient oaks and set back from the road, the darkness was a physical thing. It was a heavy, velvet blanket thrown over my head. The storm had swallowed the world. The only things that existed were the roar of the rain on the roof and the frantic, wild beating of my own heart, a drum against my ribs so loud I was scared it would hear. Fear is a funny thing. For a second, maybe two, it's pure paralysis. I was a statue at that table. But the anger, that stupid, reckless anger that got me here in the first place, it hadn't vanished. It was there, under the ice of terror, and it was screaming at me to do something. My hand, shaking uncontrollably, fumbled for my phone on the table. My thumb slid across the screen, a clumsy, greasy smear. The flashlight app. I found it. The small, bright LED cut a sharp, narrow cone through the pitch-black air. It wasn't a comfort. It just made the darkness feel bigger, more absolute. The beam was a tiny, fragile island in a hostile ocean. I stood up, the legs of my chair scraping against the bare wood with a sound that felt like a gunshot. I swept the beam across the ballroom. The familiar shapes of shrouded furniture looked monstrous, like hulking, sleeping beasts. Dust motes danced in the light like a frantic, silent snowstorm. The beam caught the grand staircase, the shadows between the balusters like prison bars. Then I panned it toward the hallway, the one that led to the servants' quarters, the one that led to the wall. My plan to be the bait, to sit and wait patiently, felt like a child's fantasy now. This wasn't a game of wits. This was something else. The storm wasn't just a storm, it was an accomplice. It had isolated me, blinded me, and deafened me to everything but its own rage. Any sound the house made, any creak, any groan, was lost in the cacophony. I had to move. Staying put felt like accepting my fate. My feet, feeling like they belonged to someone else, began to carry me forward. I kept the heavy mag light in one hand, my phone in the other, creating two shifting pools of light on the floor in front of me. Every step echoed. The house groaned around me, the old timbers complaining under the assault of the wind. A shutter somewhere upstairs slammed against a wall with a loud bang that made me jump and nearly drop my phone. I reached the hallway. It was narrower here, the darkness more concentrated. The air was thick with the smell of old plaster and something else, that faint, cloying scent of unwashed body I'd noticed before. It was stronger now. I was getting closer. My heart was a jackhammer. I was walking toward the one place on earth I should be running from. But I couldn't stop. That defiance, that need to know, it was a hook in my gut, pulling me forward. The wall, the unaccounted space, the place that had answered my drawing. My flashlight beam found it. Just a flat expanse of faded, water-stained wallpaper at the end of the hall. It looked so ordinary, so solid. I stood there, maybe 10 feet away, my light trained on the center of it. The rain was a solid wall of sound. The wind howled a low, grieving moan in the chimneys. I was breathing in short, shallow gasps, my own little rhythm section in the orchestra of the storm. Waiting. For what? I didn't know. For a sound? A sign? For the house to prove I wasn't crazy? And then I heard it. It wasn't loud. In fact, it was so quiet I almost missed it. But it was a sound that didn't belong to the storm. It cut through the roar of the rain like a razor. A single, sharp, dry click. It sounded like a lock disengaging. A mechanism. It came from directly in front of me. From the wall. I froze. My blood turned to ice water. The air left my lungs in a single, silent puff. The roaring of the storm seemed to fade into a distant hum. Everything faded except for that one spot on the wall where my light was fixed. Nothing happened. For 5 seconds. 10. An eternity. The silence after the click was 1,000 times more terrifying than the sound itself. It was the silence of something accomplished. A step completed. And then, I saw it. At first, it was just a line. A vertical seam, so faint it was barely visible in the wallpaper's pattern, was growing darker. A crack. It wasn't a crack of damage, it was a line of separation. Perfect and clean. Slowly, God, so slowly, the section of the wall my light was on, a rectangle about the size of a narrow door, began to move. It didn't swing out, it didn't swing in, it slid, perfectly and silently, sideways into the wall next to it. It recessed into the plaster, like a pocket door. My architectural mind registered the sheer impossibility of it, the brilliance of the hidden mechanism, even as the rest of my brain was simply screaming. The opening it revealed wasn't a room. It was a void, a slice of pure, unadulterated blackness that seemed to drink the light from my phone. It was darker than the power outage, a thick, solid kind of dark. And from it, a smell billowed out, hitting me like a physical blow. It was the smell of sweat, of stale food, of human filth and confinement, so potent it made my eyes water and my stomach heave. My entire body was screaming run. But I couldn't. I was hypnotized, pinned to the spot by a horror so absolute it was beyond comprehension. A shape appeared in the black rectangle. It unfolded itself from the darkness, a piece of the void peeling away and taking human form. It was a man. He was tall, but so thin he looked like a skeleton wrapped in grimy, gray skin. His clothes were tattered rags. His long, stringy hair was matted to his scalp. He slid out of the wall with a strange, boneless grace, like an insect emerging from a cocoon, and stood there in the hallway. He didn't speak, he didn't lunge, he just stood there, swaying slightly, blinking in the harsh, direct beam of my flashlight. His face was a hollowed-out mask of dirt and shadow, but it was his eyes that broke me. They were pale, washed out, and completely, utterly empty. There was no anger in them, no madness, no emotion at all. It was the blank, passionless gaze of a creature that had lived so long in the dark it had forgotten the sun. He was just watching me. An exhibit, a new thing in his environment. My light trembled, the beam dancing across his face, down his emaciated frame. And then it fell on his hand. His right hand. He was holding something. He held it clutched tight in his bony fingers, not like a tool, but like a weapon. A totem. It was long, slender, and hexagonal, with a familiar dark blue finish and silver lettering. It was my pencil, my Staedtler Mars Lumograph, 2B lead, the one that had gone missing from my table 2 weeks ago. That's the detail that shattered the spell. It was the sight of that pencil in his filthy hand, the intimate, personal violation of it. It wasn't just some phantom, some ghost. This was a man who had been feet from me while I worked, who had listened to me hum, who had watched me eat my lunch, who had crept out in the dead of night to pick through my belongings and take what he wanted, who had crept up behind me and drawn in my sketchbook. The emptiness in his eyes suddenly looked less like a void and more like a calculating, patient intelligence. He had been studying me. He took a step. It was a slow, shuffling step, his bare feet making a soft, wet, slapping sound on the wooden floor. That was it. The connection between my brain and my body re-established itself in a massive, tidal wave of adrenaline. A sound tore from my throat, a ragged, animal scream that was swallowed by the storm. I didn't think, I just acted. I dropped the maglite. It clattered to the floor, its beam spinning wildly. My hand shot out, not toward the front door, but back toward the ballroom. My fingers found the edge of a heavy, ornate side table I'd passed on my way in. On it sat an old brass table lamp with a solid, weighty base. I grabbed it. I ripped its cord from the wall socket with a single, violent jerk. I turned. He had taken another step. He was closer now, his blank stare fixed on me, the pencil still held out like a strange offering or a threat. With a guttural yell, I swung the heavy lamp with both hands and hurled it straight at him. It flew through the air, end over end, a clumsy, brass and porcelain projectile of pure panic. It crashed into the wall just beside his head with a deafening shatter of porcelain and a deep thud of metal hitting plaster. He didn't cry out, just made a low, guttural grunt and flinched back, momentarily stunned. It was all I needed. A second's opening. My instincts screamed to run for the grand staircase, for the front door, for the street. But my brain, my trained, map-making architect's brain, screamed something else. A frantic memory from the blueprints flashed in my mind. Loi Di Cho Noi Hao, Ham Row, Kua Sao, the servant's passage, the cellar, the back door. The front door was a death trap, a long, exposed run. The back way was a maze, my maze. I didn't hesitate. I turned my back on him and sprinted, not towards the faint light of the front of the house, but deeper into the darkness. Into the narrow, twisting corridor that ran behind the main kitchen, a path no visitor would ever know. My phone's light bobbed frantically ahead of me, painting stuttering, terrifying pictures on the peeling walls. Behind me, I heard a sound. A wet, hurried slap 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 on the floor. He was coming. He was fast. I risked a glance over my shoulder and saw his gaunt silhouette detach from the hallway, a spindly shape of focused, silent pursuit. He wasn't running. He was loping, an awful, unnaturally fluid motion that was terrifyingly efficient. The air grew thick with the smell of rotten damp earth as I neared the back of the house. The door to the cellar stairs was there, just where the blueprints said it would be. I threw my shoulder against it. It flew open, and I plunged down into a darkness that was even more complete than before, my feet finding stone steps slick with a century of damp. I could hear him at the top of the stairs. I could almost feel his breath. He was right behind me. The darkness was absolute, a thick, smothering presence that smelled of wet earth and decay. The stone steps were slick, treacherous. I didn't dare use my phone's light anymore. It felt like a beacon, a target. I went down on one hip, half falling, half sliding, my hands scraping against the gritty, moss-covered wall for balance. Each breath was a ragged sob, burning in my lungs. Behind me, I heard him. The sound wasn't the frantic pounding of a normal chase. It was that same, steady, awful slap 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 of his bare feet on the stone, a rhythm that was both unhurried and terrifyingly close. It was the sound of something that knew it didn't have to rush. I could hear his breathing, too. It wasn't the panting of exertion, but a low, wet, hungry sound, like an animal sniffing the air. It felt like it was right on the back of my neck. My architectural memory, the one thing that hadn't been consumed by sheer animal terror, was screaming at me. The plans, the cellar, west wall, ground-level exit to the gardens, behind the kitchens. Used for ice delivery, it was a lifeline in the black void. I reached the bottom of the stairs and crashed onto the stone floor, the impact sending a jolt of pain up my spine. For a second, I just lay there, a crumpled heap in the stinking dark, the sound of his descent getting closer, louder. No, I couldn't stop. I crawled, my knees grinding into the uneven flagstones. My hands swept through puddles of stagnant water and what felt like slick, rotting leaves. The air was so thick it was hard to breathe. I kept one hand on the wall, using it as my guide. West wall, my fingers brushed against wood. A door, it had to be it. I fumbled in the dark for a handle, a latch, anything. My fingers found a large, horizontal iron bar. A bolt. It was heavy, rusted solid. He was at the bottom of the stairs now. I could hear the wet shuffle of his feet on the stone floor behind me. He wasn't loping anymore. He was walking, slowly, savoring it. A new wave of adrenaline, cold and sharp, surged through me. My sob turned into a guttural grunt of effort. I put both hands on the iron bolt and heaved. It didn't budge. I tried again, my nails scraping, my shoulder slamming against the rough wood of the door. Nothing. It was fused by a century of rust and neglect. Behind me, a soft scrape. I knew, without seeing, that he had stopped. He was watching me, waiting, giving me this one last, futile moment of hope before he closed the distance. I screamed. It wasn't a call for help, there was no one to hear. It was a scream of pure, primal rage. I took a step back, then threw my entire body weight against the door, right next to the bolt. My shoulder connected with a sickening crunch. The pain was blinding, but I heard another sound, a sound more beautiful than any music, a loud crack of splintering wood, followed by the grating shriek of metal giving way. The door flew open. I pitched forward, out of the suffocating darkness of the cellar and into the roaring chaos of the storm. Rain, cold and hard as pellets, hit me in the face. Wind tore at my clothes. I was on my hands and knees in the mud of a neglected garden bed. I scrambled to my feet, my ankle twisting beneath me, and just ran. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I ran blindly through the overgrown garden, thorny branches tearing at my arms and face, the sound of the wind and rain a deafening symphony that finally, blessedly, drowned out the sound of his pursuit. I burst through a collapsed section of iron fence and onto the empty, rain-slicked pavement of the side street. It was deserted. The streetlights were out. The whole world was dark and empty, and I was alone with the monster from the walls. Panic began to claw its way back up my throat, a cold, choking hand. I had escaped the house, but where could I go? And then I saw it. At the far end of the block, two beams of light cut through the downpour, sweeping slowly across the fronts of the houses. Headlights. They were moving, coming my way. I didn't even register what it was, just that it was light, it was a machine, it was civilization. I ran towards it, waving my arms, my voice a shredded wreck. Help, please, help me. The car, I saw now it was a police cruiser, slowed to a crawl. The spotlight on its roof flicked on, pinning me in its harsh, white glare. I must have looked like a madwoman, soaked to the bone, covered in mud and blood from a dozen scratches, sobbing hysterically. I stumbled into the middle of the road, and the car screeched to a halt just feet from me. A door flew open, and an officer was out, his hand on his weapon. "Ma'am, stay right there. What's going on?" The words just spilled out of me, a torrent of terrified nonsense. In the house. The Miltenberger house. He's in the walls. He was in the walls. To his credit, the officer didn't dismiss me. He and his partner exchanged a look, then the second officer was on the radio, his voice a calm, steady stream of codes. The first officer came toward me slowly, his other hand holding a large flashlight. He took in my condition, the terror in my eyes, and his entire demeanor shifted from caution to concern. Okay, easy now," he said, his voice firm but gentle. "You're safe. We're here." He wrapped a heavy police jacket around my shoulders. It was the warmest, safest thing I had ever felt. What happened next is a blur. More cars arrived, their red and blue lights painting the storm-lashed trees in silent, strobing bursts of color. I sat in the back of the first cruiser, wrapped in a coarse wool blanket, sipping hot, syrupy coffee from a thermos someone had given me. I watched as a team of officers, armed and with dogs, moved on the house. They didn't use the front door. I told them about the cellar, about the back. I don't know how much time passed. I just sat there, shaking, the adrenaline slowly draining out of me, leaving behind a deep, bone-aching exhaustion and a trembling that wouldn't stop. Then, one of the original officers came back to the car and opened my door. "We got him," he said, his voice flat. He didn't put up a fight. Was just standing in the cellar. Like he was waiting. Relief washed over me so powerfully I thought I was going to pass out. I started crying again, but this time it was quiet, exhausted weeping. It was over. "He's a transient we've had some contact with before, but never anything like this," the officer continued, looking away from me, toward the house. "Looks like he's been in there for years. Years. He set up a whole living space inside that wall cavity you found. Rigged a pulley system for the door. Siphoning electricity. We found a nest. Food wrappers, stolen items." I nodded numbly. My pencil, the granola bar wrapper, it all made a sick kind of sense. He was just a desperately ill, homeless man. A squatter who had found the perfect hiding place. The horror was immense, but it was a horror I could understand. I was the unlucky person who had disturbed his territory. That was all. I was wrong. It wasn't all. About an hour later, as the dawn started to break and the storm subsided to a miserable drizzle, a different detective, a woman with tired eyes and a grim set to her mouth, approached the car. She wasn't holding a coffee. She was holding a clear evidence bag, and inside it was an old wooden cigar box. "Alara," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "We found this in his living quarters. I need to ask you about it." She crouched down to my level. "Inside the box, we found these." She pulled out a second, smaller evidence bag. It contained a stack of small, Moleskine-style sketchbooks. They were identical to the one I use. Exactly identical. My heart, which had just started to beat normally, began to hammer against my ribs again. I don't understand. He was a prolific artist, it seems, she said, her voice devoid of any irony. Each one of these is a study. A complete study of a single person. She carefully laid a few of the books out on the car's hood, protected from the drizzle by the overhang of the open door. She opened one. The drawings were exquisite. They were done in graphite, with a technical precision that was terrifying. They showed a man in a plumber's uniform, his face, his tools, the way he held a wrench. In the margins were tiny, neat notes. Arrives 8:15 a.m. Leaves 4:30 p.m. Eats tuna sandwich in van for lunch. Smokes Pall Malls. Taps front left pocket when nervous. The cover of the sketchbook had a title, written in the same neat hand. Plumbing Contractor, 2011. She opened another. A woman in a smart suit, studying a painting in the ballroom. The detail was incredible. The pattern on her scarf. The brand of her handbag. The title, Art Appraiser, 2004. And another. A young couple, laughing, their arms around each other on the grand staircase. Title, Trespassers, 1998. We ran the names and descriptions, the detective said, her voice now barely a whisper. The plumber was reported missing by his wife a week after his last job here. His van was found abandoned 2 towns over. The appraiser never made her flight home. The couple, their families have been looking for them for 25 years. They were just gone. There are a dozen of these books, Alara. A dozen people, going back to the early 90s. None of them were ever seen again after they spent time in this house. The cold that flooded my veins had nothing to do with the wet clothes or the morning air. It was a deep, internal freeze. This wasn't a squatter. This was a predator. The house wasn't his shelter, it was his hunting blind. And I wasn't just some random person who stumbled upon him. I was the new project. The detective looked at me, her eyes full of a grim pity that was more terrifying than anything else I had seen all night. She reached back into the large evidence bag and pulled out one last sketchbook. It was newer than the others. The cover was clean. She didn't have to open it. I already knew what it was. She held it up for me to see. On the cover, in that same, meticulous, spidery handwriting, was the title. Architecture Intern 2023 Alara. She slowly opened it. My breath caught in my throat. There I was, a sketch of me at my drafting table, my brow furrowed in concentration. Another of me eating my sandwich on the porch steps, my head tilted to one side. A shockingly detailed drawing of my hand, holding my pencil. There were pages of them. Observations, studies, my entire existence for the past 3 weeks, catalogued by an unseen observer just feet away. She turned to the last drawn page. It was a sketch of me from the night before, slumped over my table, asleep, a single line of drool on my chin. It was a moment of vulnerability I hadn't even been aware of. Beneath it, a note. Subject is working late. Storm coming, an opportunity. Then she turned the page one last time. It was blank, a fresh, empty, white page. Except for one small, perfect detail. At the very top, printed in neat, patient block letters, was a date. Today's date.